Anugrah Rao. Welcome to the 58th episode of Microsoft Hour of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Millionlights is a TV channel dedicated to improving skills of people and their employability. Now, let me tell you more about Microsoft Hour of Code. Microsoft Hour of Code is a series of lectures, courses, and talks by experts who are going to discuss the latest Microsoft technologies, topics related to programming, and industry forecasts that are all focused on employability. This course is basically for people pursuing computer science. This content has been created by our partner Microsoft. And today we have Christopher Harrison and Suzanne with us who will be discussing everything you need to know about creating website with Python, Flask and SQL. Create, configure and connect to SQL databases. Learn to structure your code, check out advanced UI options, find out what Jinja templates can do for you and get started with Bootstrap. Get the skills you need to publish a professional website and level up your Python and Flask knowledge. Now, let's move towards the course. In the previous course, we covered object-oriented programming and some part of relational databases. In this course, we will cover the remaining part of relational databases, in which we will talk about different databases products, Microsoft SQL Server in Azure, how to connect database from Python, inserting a record, retrieving a record, and demo also. So let's get started.
You know, some of you may be going, but my gosh, if I've already started building the application, switching from Redis to a relational database when I'm halfway through development could just mess up all my code. That's why all the stuff we talked about in the last two modules is so important. If you've structured your code and you've made a class that is taking care of the reading and the writing to your data source, then you'll actually discover you can actually switch over from one data source to another, even though we're going from a key value pair system to a relational database system, and it can be relatively transparent to the rest of your code if you've structured your code well. That's why those previous two modules are so important. So let's take a look at talk about the right tool for the right job. That's a great point, because I want to talk about, there are actually different relational database products out there. So let's take a minute and just talk about some of the different ones that are out there you can choose from. So you've got SQL Server, that's Microsoft's premier relational database tool. Oracle has one as well. You'll also hear about MySQL. MySQL is an open source relational database product. There's also Access. A lot of people discover Access as a relational database tool because it comes with the higher editions of Office. So it's often in a lot of small companies a popular way of getting started with relational databases where they don't necessarily need full SQL Server. And of course, in this day and age, you're going to keep hearing about the cloud because if you are going to create a database and you're going to have your application read and write to a database, well, when you put that website out to the world and let the world access your website, they all have to be able to access the database. So you probably aren't going to have that running on your laptop. You're going to need that out on a server somewhere or something like that. So you can go off and set up hosting and set up a database server with the database running on it. But what you might find simpler would be to just put your database in the cloud. So that way it's taken care of. Someone else is hosting the server and taking care of backing up a server and all that stuff. And you're not worried about whether you put on the latest security updates and all those strange things that you have to worry about when you're managing your own server and database. So another option is to actually have your database in the cloud. So we have Microsoft Azure SQL Database, which also allows you to do a relational database in the cloud. So SQL Server and Oracle said they're really full-featured database products. There's always going to be a free version. There's a SQL Server Express and there's an Oracle Database Express that you can use. The difference between the free and the paid versions are going to give you increased functionality. Obviously, there's going to be extra things you can do when you pay for a full license. SQL Server runs on Windows. If you are running on Linux, then you would probably want to, Oracle is going to run on Windows or Linux. So SQL Server, when you're installing it on your own machine, will only run on Windows.
You could always set up a VM.
You could set up a VM, yes, in terms of on Windows.
Yep,
but yeah,
absolutely.
But that's one of the differences between the products. MySQL, on the other hand, now that is an open source relational database product. You can get MySQL Community Server for free. There is also a paid version of MySQL, again, which the paid version is always going to give you better functionality or increased functionality. You can often start with the free version just to learn your way around it, and then eventually you may find you need the features of a paid version, but you can start with the free to learn it, absolutely. And you can run MySQL on Windows or on Linux, and you can also run it on Azure as well. So that can also run in the cloud. Microsoft Access, it said it's a tool that actually comes with Office Professional or Office 365. Actually, the more recent versions of Access are actually now using SQL Server components or Azure SQL Server components on the back end. So the difference between Access and SQL Server and Microsoft Azure SQL Database is getting very small now. It's almost just becoming a front end with the same back end engine. And Access also runs on Windows. Then you have Microsoft Azure SQL Database. That's a database that is stored in the cloud. So that means you don't have to worry when you publish that website, you don't have to go moving a copy of a database to somewhere else that other people can access it. It's in the cloud, the server's taken care of for you. You just say, hey, Azure, you manage all that stuff for me. I just want to create my tables and let people connect directly to it. So it's a little easier in terms of managing and maintenance for you. But of course, then the way it works in terms of instead of you buying SQL Server and installing that on your own box, when you work with SQL Azure, what you do is you pay sort of a monthly fee based on how big your database is and how many people are accessing it. And that's the way it's paid for. Instead of you buy the software and install it, it's you pay for the space on the servers effectively and for the network connectivity to send the data back and forth. There is a pricing calculator if you're thinking, oh, you know, what's going to be cheaper? What makes more sense? There are pricing calculators on the Azure page that'll help you calculate based on how much data you're storing and how much data is moving back and forth, how much it'll cost.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And the neat thing is everybody can access the data in the cloud. You can control the permissions of who can access that data, but it said you don't have to go maintain your own server. So that's, again, a lot of theories. So we've looked at what is a relational database. We've talked about some of the different choices of products out there. Let's actually see how you physically create a database. So you can actually create a database and connect to it from your code.
Yeah, let's actually do it.
Yeah, I think so. So how do we do it? Well, there's always going to be 3 basic steps. One, you're going to have to, if you're working with anything that's on-premise, then you're going to need to install that product on your computer. So if I'm working with SQL Server, I have to install SQL Server. Then I have to create the database, because installing the software, installing SQL Server on my machine does not mean I have a database. It means I have the software to create a database. So then the next step becomes create the database. So I have to go into a tool and say, create my database. And then the third step is going to be, now that I have a database, let's create the tables I need inside that database. So what does that look like? I want us to imagine the next version, the next release of our application, Christopher.
Okay, all right. Well, imagine the next release.
Yes. So, you know, a lot of trivia games actually have categories set up.
Okay.
So when somebody comes in, they can say, oh, give me a bunch of sports trivia, give me entertainment trivia. That's what I really love. So I want somebody coming to our website to be able to focus in on their favorite trivia area.
Give me sports trivia.
You want the sports trivia?
I want sports
awesome.
Trivia. All right.
I like geography trivia. I'm all about state, capitals, but not U.S. geography questions, which I get far too much on all those game shows. I'm terrible. I never know which state is next to which one. But ask me. Well, I was going to say the capital of Zimbabwe, and the answer would be I don't know. But but I like having.
It's bad when you give a demo trivia question, then realize halfway through
I don't know the answer. Yeah, exactly. So I want to be able to set up the ability to sort of divide our questions into categories. So I'd like to design a database that allows that future version. I know the website doesn't support it yet, but I'd like to design my database for that. So if we take a look, I've got a plan for a database design, and hopefully you're okay with this. What I'd like to do is have a questions table, and for each question, we're going to store a question name, just like we do now, because that'll make, I figure, it easier to migrate to the new version.
Okay.
We're still going to have a question description,
a
correct answer, which we have to store. So the only thing I'm really adding here is a category ID. So each question is going to have a category ID, and then I have a categories table where I can look up the description for that category. So I'm hoping that what we'll be able to do is when a user comes in, eventually we'll have a drop box, and they'll pick their category, and then we can give them questions in that category. Does that work for you?
That works perfect.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so we've got a basic design. So I've designed my tables. Now I'm ready to go in, create a database, and start creating those tables. And I'm going to do my first demo using SQL Server. So I've already installed Microsoft SQL Server. If you haven't installed it yet, you can absolutely go, when you get the slides, the link is there. Microsoft SQL Server Express with Tools is what you want to install. If you have any trouble with the installation process, most of it is really just follow the prompts and accept the default values. But there is another link there which gives you some good resources on what do those different questions mean if you're curious to learn a little bit more. And then once I've done that, I'm going to go into SQL Server Management Studio. I'm going to right-click Databases, click New Database, and I'm going to demo this in a second. And then give my database a name. And then finally, I'll be able to go in, expand what we call the Object Explorer, create a new table, and specify the columns and the data types for the table.
And you're just kind of kicking through the slides here.
Yeah, because I want to get you to the demo. You want to see me do this live.
The demo. Yeah, because really, I mean, the slides, they're screenshots and they're great documentation, but anybody who's watching can just go to the FAQ tab or go to the GitHub. Something tells me I'm going to have to put that into the Q&A. But can go to the GitHub repo and go ahead and download all the slides.
Right, so those are there for you later when you're trying to remember steps. But, that's the basic steps. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to show it to you because I think that's going to have a lot more meaning.
Yep, absolutely.
Now, one of the things is when we do create the table, there's two different ways we can create a table. One of the ways is with the GUI. There is actually a command tool inside SQL Server Management Studio where I can sort of go right-click, create table. It gives me a little window, and I type in my column names, and it sort of writes the command for me. You can also write SQL or SQL statements for a structured query language. You can write your own commands to create the tables. And the great thing about SQL commands is it doesn't matter if you're using Access, if you're using SQL Server, if you're using MySQL, or if you're using SQL Azure databases, SQL is actually a standard language. So the syntax for creating a table or inserting a row or selecting a record is going to be the same regardless of which relational database product you use. So that's one of the things that's really nice about SQL. So if you just take a glance at the slide, I'll show you the basic syntax of how you create a table. And so what I would do here is you create a table. So there's your basic syntax. And then you have to specify the table name. My table is going to be called questions because that's the name I specified here. It's not case sensitive, but I should be treating it as case sensitive. So hang on, maybe I better
learn that earlier today.
I got to change this to an uppercase, not because it's required by SQL, but because we know it's just a good practice. Okay, so go back to the slide, and then we have a column called question name.
Weren't you paying attention earlier today?
Apparently I was. And then so I'm going to create a column called question name, and this nvarchar 50. Nvarchar is SQL Server's syntax for that. Basically means it's a string.
Unicode.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a string, and it's Unicode, which means it can handle languages other than basic English and French. So if you were dealing with German or even getting into Arabic and Chinese that has special characters in it, nvarchar can handle those types of special characters. If you just go varchar, then that limits you to basic sort of English, French, German characters.
Indo-European. I used to say Germanic, and I actually had a linguistics major come up to me after class and said, no, what you really mean is Indo-European. So Indo-European, that's what I've been told.
That's when you need nvarchar?
No, that will handle varchar, and then nvarchar is when you need to go beyond that to Cyrillic alphabets and otherwise. And by the way, you'll also notice the pronunciation differences.
Varchar, varchar. Well, I'm a Canadian, eh?
Yeah, so I've always used the hard C, but in any event.
And the varchar, by the way, that's for variable character. So that means I don't know how long the string is going to be, because something like a name, it might be 5 characters long, it might be 50 characters long, I don't know. So it's a variable length. There is also a char, which is for fixed length as well.
Yep.
So I specify that it's a string, and then you'll also notice that I specify the size. So that's the maximum number of characters I can store for a question name. And finally, I specify null or not null, and this basically means, is it mandatory? So if it is mandatory, then I say it's not null. It is not allowed to be null. Null means blank. Null means you haven't entered anything for that value. So whenever I say not null, I'm saying you have to, anytime you give me a new question, you have got to give me a value for the question name, or I'm not taking it. So that's what the not null does. So now if you actually take a step back and look at the syntax, hopefully it makes a little more sense. So create a table called questions. And so there's, I said, our table name. And then we can see our 4 columns. Question name, description, correct answer, category ID. We specified the data types for all of them. All of them are a character except for category ID, which is an integer. That's my numeric value. And I'm making all of them mandatory. Then there's some small syntax things here, like I have to specify a comma to separate each of my column definitions. And I've got parentheses around the entire list of columns. So there's a few things there, just syntax. You can, lots and lots of resources out there on basic SQL syntax. If you say, create table SQL, you'll quickly find some samples that you can use as reference.
And real quick into the Q&A, I posted in a link to another MVA that's a database fundamentals. So that way, if you're looking to get a bit more into this, you can go ahead and check that out.
Perfect, yes. There's an MVA for that.
There is an MVA for that. Yeah, we need a T-shirt.
All right, so let's go ahead and go into SQL Server and actually create a database and create our table inside SQL Server. So what I've installed it already. So the tool we use when working with SQL Server is SQL Server Management Studio. That's the client tool that allows us to connect to our databases. And what I'm going to do is I am going to go here to my server, and I'm going to go to my database, and I'm going to say I want to create a new database.
Okay.
And I give my database a name. So I'm just going to...
Steve.
I was thinking quiz database.
All right.
Call me crazy there, but I thought QuizDB for a quiz database was better than, you know.
Oh, where's your sense of adventure?
I know. I'm just boring that way. So I call it QuizDB, and then I'm going to go and click OK. And literally, all the defaults for now, for what I'm doing, if you're just exploring, you can generally leave all the defaults.
In real world, that's probably not the best way to leave the defaults on the sizes in particular.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff you can get into. Again, if you want to learn more about what are all those options and things in there, there's an MVA for that.
There is an MVA.
There's an MVA for that.
Yes, auto grow is bad.
Yeah, but this at least gets you started, gets you in, so you can start playing and start connecting.
Absolutely.
And so now you can see I have over here on the left-hand side, you can now actually see that I have this quiz database that's created. You can also see my backup quiz database because I was afraid I didn't make a sacrifice or a tribute to the demo guide, so I was afraid something would go wrong. So I have an extra one just in case. All right, so what I can do now is I have my database. Now I want to add some tables to it because right now if I look in there, I don't have any, there's these system and file tables that are added because you're creating by default, but I want to go and create a brand new table. And one of the nice things about working with Management Studio is it gives me the ability to just sort of, it gives me a nice window. It says, well, what column name would you like? Well, I'd like column name of question name. And what data type would you like? And I'd like that nvarchar with a size of 50. And I don't want to allow any nulls. It's going to be a mandatory field. And then I'm going to have...
You need to take the checkbox out.
Oh, yes, that's true. I don't want to allow nulls.
There you go.
Correct. Thank you. Then I have a description, and that is going to be another varchar, just, to be clear, varchar, just to annoy Christopher. And then I'm going to have you have to, of course, be able to store the correct answer to the question. So I need a column for that. And finally, I have my category ID, which is going to be an integer.
Yep.
And you can see all the different data types there that you can choose from, but varchar and int are probably the most common ones that you'll be working with. Now, you will notice so far I haven't specified a name for my table yet. It's not going to ask me for a name for the table until I go ahead and hit save. So when I go up in the top left corner up here, when I hit that save button, that's actually going to bring up, woo, I like to make people dizzy. That's when it's going to prompt me to enter a name for my table.
Steve.
Questions. So now I actually have a table, and sure enough, now if I go over here initially, you're going to go here and go, wait, your table's not there.
Yeah, that's something that gets people all the time.
Yes, don't panic. All you have to do is just right-click and say, please refresh the list of tables, and aha, there's my questions table, and you can even expand that table and see that it has the columns and that everything looks right, that it's question name, description, correct answer, category ID, and so on. So I have gone ahead, I have created my table.
Perfect.
Awesome. So I have now created a database and created a table in it.
And you could start creating multiple tables and start actually creating relationships and so forth. So we could really go, a lot of different directions with this. And one of the things that, we're going to kind of challenge everybody else to do is, hey, look, we're showing you how to get in and create the basics of the database. Maybe what you decide to do going forward is to update the application to start incorporating categories. So we're sort of like teasing it at this point, but you could absolutely take what we've done and keep building upon it.
That's right.
Yep.
Okay, now that's how I just want to show another option as well, though, because I think it's really important to look at how similar it is in different tools and products. So I want to show you how we do the same thing in Azure. Because it is nice, especially when you're playing around with things in yourself. Your first one, Azure's a great option for hosting your data. So the interesting thing is usually step one is install the product, but when you work with Azure, you don't have to install any software. The whole point of using Azure is the software is already out there in the cloud. You're using the software that's already there, already installed on a server.
Yep.
So instead of needing to install software, what you're going to need is a Microsoft Azure account. And then you're going to log into Microsoft Azure with your account and say, okay, now I'm logged into my account. Give me a SQL Server database in that cloud. So what we're going to do, and again, this is the slides for your reference later. I'm going to go do this as a demo, but I have it here in the slides. I'll walk through it quickly, and then we'll slow down when we do the demo. So when we create the database, we have to go to the Azure Portal. That's where we go to log in and say, hey, I want a new database. We're going to pick the option and say, give me a new SQL database. And there's a little quick create button where we specify our database name, how we're going to pay for it, because remember, Azure is a service. Instead of buying the software, you're paying someone else to store it all for you. And where we want the server. If you live in India, you're going to want to pick an Azure server that is close to India. If you are in Australia, you're going to want to pick an Azure server that's down in Australia. If you're on the East Coast versus the West Coast in North America, there are different servers, East and West US. And then we can create our actual tables. So that once we've created our database, same thing we did in SQL Server. 1, create the database. 2, create the table. So we'll do that in Azure. But they don't give us this beautiful graphical interface when we are connecting to Azure, so we will have to use the SQL command this time to create it. We could have used the SQL command to create the table inside SQL Server as well, but I chose the GUI. But in Azure, we'll have to use the SQL command. Now, there's a couple of extra steps you do have to worry about when you're working with Azure. Because Azure is out there on someone else's server, you have to tell Azure who's allowed to connect to that server. So you have to say, hey, the IP address I'm on over here, let it connect, please. Otherwise, when you try and connect from your tools and from your code, Azure's going to come back and go, no, 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 not for you. No data for you, I don't let you connect. So not allowed. So it'll actually prevent you from doing that. So it's important that you allow the IP address so it can be done.
Once again, showing our age.
Yes, I know. Making bad references to old television shows. Come back in 1 year. Yes. Wasn't that the line?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Although the fact that it's 90s and we're saying that's old, that's, yeah.
Yeah,
anyway.
okay. We're just getting old. I've learned to accept it. And then the other thing is we're still going to use the SQL Server Management Studio tool to connect to the database on Azure. So we still use the same tool. It's just the database is stored on Azure instead. Okay, so let's actually jump ahead. I'm going to do this as a demo. I'm just going to flip past the slides here. And so the slides here with all kinds of reference information, so you can learn how to do it and practice it on your own later for reference. But I'm going to actually just jump right up to the demo so you can see this in action and sort of explain it as I go through the demonstration.
Perfect.
So what I'm going to need first is I'm going to have to go to that Azure portal. So let's go here. And I'll be honest, I always forget the URL for the Azure portal. So I usually just go to Bing and I just say search on Azure. And I go, there it is, first one listed, azure.microsoft.com. And that's going to bring me to the Azure page. And in the top right-hand corner up there, you can see there's portal. And that's what I'm just going to click on to take myself to the Azure portal. So that I find, to be honest, is the easiest way to get there. I'm terrible at remembering URLs. There you go, manage.windowsazure.com. That's what I should have typed in, but if you forget, just search on Azure. So it's going to bring up the portal here. Chugga,
chugga, chugga.
Come on, come on. Blank screen. Come on, baby.
Come on.
There we go. All right. And actually, I'm already logged in. If you weren't logged in at this point, you would get a login screen saying, please log into the portal, and you'd have to enter your Azure account ID and Azure password. But what I want to do now is I want to create a brand new database. So I go down to the bottom of the screen down here, and I'm going to select New. And that pops up all my different options. Now I want to create a database, and that's going to be under Data Services. And, oh, sorry, I'm missing, Data Services. And then there's SQL Database. And I choose Quick Create. You can do Custom Create, but Quick Create, honestly, for most of the stuff we're going to be doing right now, is going to be perfectly fine.
It's also quicker.
It's quicker, yes. And given that we're doing a demo, we'll keep it quicker. So I'll zoom out a bit here so you can see. And then I can specify a database name, and I'm going to stick with QuizDB. Worked for me.
Sure.
I think Steve was already taken.
Dang it.
And then I pick my subscription. So I have an account, and this is my Azure subscription. And then I pick a suitable location. Since right now I'm in Seattle, I'm going to choose to pick a server in the Western US, because that's going to be nice and close to me, and I'll get the best performance by having something close by. And then I say, go ahead, please, and create that SQL database. Now, if I go on the left-hand side here, there's a whole bunch of different Azure things you can create on Azure. And in this case, I was creating a SQL database. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to select that SQL databases. And what we can see, if we zoom in a little bit there, is you can actually see there's my QuizDB. It's already created and already online.
Yep.
So there's my database created in Azure. So step 1 is completed. I've created a database. Step 2, I need to tell Azure to let me connect to that database from this computer here. So to do that, I have to go down to the bottom here, and there's an option here called Manage. And when you click on that Manage, it actually sort of pops up a window and says, whoop, that's not quite what I was after. I must have already enabled the IP address. If you haven't enabled the IP address for this machine, then it's going to, I was on the wrong one, QuizDB. Databases, QuizDB, make sure that one's selected, and say Manage. There we go. And you'll notice it gives me a message saying, this current IP address is not in the existing firewall rules. Do you want to update the firewall rules so you can connect? And I'm like, yes, please, because otherwise my code will not be able to connect to this database. So I say yes, and it says, do I want to manage it now? No, all I wanted to do was say, let my computer connect, please. Because now I should be able to go over to SQL Server Management Studio, and up in the top left-hand corner here, you have this option of Connect. And when you connect to a database engine, I can now tell it to go connect to my Azure database instead of connecting to my local database. But it's going to ask me my server name. And I'm like, localhost means this computer. But Azure is not this computer. So I need to find out that server name somehow.
Yep.
So how do I find out that server name? Well, I'm going to have to go back to that portal and go back to that portal here. And if I take a look, one of the easiest ways to do it actually is if you pick this database, you pick your quiz database, and you choose the dashboard. There's a wonderful little option here that pops up under the quick glance menu called Show Me My Connection Strings. And I love using this because it allows me to, and this is the one time I will allow copy and paste. I can copy and paste the server name because it's going to be kind of long and scary looking. So you can see these are connection strings, and you can say it says, hey, guess what server you're on? It's good old RDLU1D1PX9.
So, yeah, one of the things to keep in mind, so originally when this was put out there, you didn't have the ability to name your database server. And not to dig too deep into it, but it has the same exact hierarchy as SQL. So you've got your server or instance, and then your databases are contained inside of it. So you didn't have the ability to name your server because, frankly, the name of the server doesn't matter. That just like Susan is showing here, you're just going to go copy it, and away you go from there. And you basically just type that in one time per application, or at least if you design it properly, you're just going to type it in one time, and that's it. Now, one of the things that we're not showing, and this is a conscious decision, is there is a new portal that's available for Azure, and it's actually portal.azure.com. The only reason I remember that is I just did an MBA on it. And the thing about the new Azure portal is it's more robust. It handles kind of more complex environments a lot better. I love a lot of the features, but it is still very much in beta and has its beta works. That's the word I'm going to use there. But one of the cool things that you can do in the portal that you cannot do inside of the current portal. So this
the
is
one
the
I'm
current portal.
demoing.
Yeah, I don't want to call it old because it's the current one. The one big thing that you don't have the ability to do in the current portal is name your SQL Server, your Azure SQL Server. In the new portal, in the one that's going to be coming out, you do have the ability to name it. So just
which would be nice, because
absolutely.
I mean,
so that way you can call it Steve
instead of RDL1DPX9, which is such a nice name, though.
Yeah, that's what you're going to name your next kid.
Absolutely. So now I can go here and I can say, well, when I want to connect to my database engine, I now know the server name. So I want to connect to that server name. And literally, it's that whole one, though I don't think I need the TCP and the port number.
You do not.
So I'm going to take that off. All I need is that server name.database.windows.net. Then, login. What am I logging in as? That's an interesting question because, it says, okay, well, my user ID is apparently Mikey, good old Mikey, and it says password is your password here. I don't remember typing in a password at any time when I was creating this database. It never said, hey, what password are you going to use to log in?
Right, because you were using an existing server when you set that up.
Yeah. So what I want to do is when you do this for the first time, what you're going to want to do is go back to the list of databases that you have. So once again, I can see here's my database listed in my list of SQL databases for Azure. And then I'm going to click on the actual server name over here. So here we have a list of servers. I'm going to click on that server name, and that's going to take me to the server page. And if I go to the server dashboard, there's an option there to reset the administrator password. So that way you know how to log in to your own server.
Kind of an important thing.
Yeah, so I'm going to give it a very complex password that I will remember. Steve. And
no, that's the name, not a password.
Is that it? Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
What if I use like an ampersand in Steve's name, Steve at? So what I've done is I've just changed the password. So now when I go back to my list of databases and I select my database, bring up the dashboard and show those connection strings again, I can now just copy that user ID, bring that over here, and type in the password I just set. And we should, dum-de-dum, drum roll please, find out that the firewall didn't let me in. Okay. If this happens to you, then the most useful thing is to make a little note of what that IP address is. So this is a case where Azure's saying, I'm not sure about this IP address yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to Azure. And I'm going to go to my database and it is manage the allowed IP addresses in the bottom right-hand corner over here. I'm going to go to that, select that option, and I'm just going to go add that address that I'm trying to connect with because I have occasionally had this problem before in the studio. So let's call this the studio, and the address was, let me find that error message.
131, 107, 160, 93.
131, 107.
107, 160.
170? 160?
160, 93.
93. I'm just going to double check that. Was that 107 or 160? It was 107.
Yeah.
So I had it typed it in wrong there. May as well try and be nice to the demo gods here. And I'm just going to say, please allow that. Save that. So I'm just saying, hey, if you're trying to connect to this IP address, I'm telling Azure, let that IP address in. And now I'm going to try once again to connect. And this time, you'll actually see appearing on the left-hand side of a screen now, I can actually see two databases.
Yep.
I can see my local database, which I created in SQL Server, and here I am connected to my database, my QuizDB. This was the one that's on Azure. But it doesn't have a table.
It doesn't have a table.
So my next step is now that I can connect to it from Management Studio is to go create that table. So to create a table, what I have to do is I have to do a SQL command. So if I go to tables and I right click and say I want to make a new table, this is kind of nice. It actually gives me the basic syntax for creating a table right inside the window. So it doesn't give me a graphical user interface where I can just type it in, but it does at least give me the basic syntax of the command. So what I'm going to do now, if we just go back, Though I find this kind of almost too much, so I'm going to simplify that code a little bit and say I'm just creating a table called questions.
I'm going to simplify this code. Delete everything. Capital Q, by the way.
Oh, capital Q. That's right. We were going like capital. Not that it would break the code, but we're trying to be
case sensitive.
Good habits. And we're going to have question name, which was an nvarchar 50 and was not null. And one of the things also about Azure is it will sometimes it'll give you an error if you try and insert table into a data but doesn't have a primary key. A primary key is something that uniquely identifies a record in the table. So how do I know if you tell me the question name, I know exactly which question you want. If you want to give me a customer ID, I know exactly which customer you want. If you tell me an order ID, I know exactly which order you're looking for. I can give you back exactly one record. That column is your primary key. And it helps the database make sure you don't end up two records but have the same customer ID or have the same question name, because that would really mess up people trying to use your application.
Yep.
So if we just go back now, that's why I've added that word primary key there. You can do that in your SQL Server tables as well, but it is actually required. Your tables have to have one. You won't get an error message when you create it, but later when you try and add records to a table, you'll get an error message back when your code tries to add saying, hey, there's no primary key on the table. I won't let you put in records.
Right. So. And while Susan's just typing away on her command, one of the other things again to mention, because one of the things about cloud services, and it's one of the great things, is that there's constantly new features that are being added. So one of the things that is now being added is a new version of SQL Azure databases, and it does add on a lot more functionality. And one of the things actually is you can now create what's known as a heap or table without a primary key. But if I remember right, and this of course,
this is literally in the last few weeks, changes.
Yeah, this is relatively new, and this is something that could also change by the time that this course is available for on demand. But at least as of right now, I believe it's only available for U.S. servers. So only if you're hosting the database here in the U.S. will it actually work. So anyway, so have you finished?
So I've typed in the command here. Okay. You can see my create table. It's just like it was on the slide. The only difference is I do have that extra keyword up here, primary key. That's the only difference from what we had on the slide. And to execute that command inside SQL Server, the way we do that is up here there's an execute button. I can also use the F5 key inside SQL Server Management Studio, which is kind of convenient. It's just like running code inside Visual Studio. F5 is the magic keyword. And sure enough, there I go. Command was completed successfully. And now if I go over here and I refresh my tables, I can see that I have successfully created my questions table, and I can even check that the columns, and you can even see a little picture of a key beside question name because I made that a primary key.
Yep.
All right, so hopefully what you saw in that is that the syntax and the tools may be a little bit different, but the basic method for set up a database and create tables is going to be the same no matter what product you use. I've got a couple of links here in case you want to try doing it in MySQL. It's going to be the same SQL command. You still have to create a database. If you want to see more about SQL Server, some nice links there that'll help you out. Yep. But I think that takes us to the end of this module.
Yeah, so here's, you know what great shows do?
What's that?
Great shows have cliffhangers, and we're going to give you a cliffhanger because right now, here's what we've done: is we updated our app, we got it all set up so we could switch it over and start using SQL Server. Susan went in, she set up that database, and now we're going to go ahead and take a meal break. So after the meal break, we'll actually take a look at how to update our application to have it use that SQL database that we created. So we'll see you in about an hour. Enjoy.
See you soon.
Hopefully, all of you enjoyed a bit of food. I know that we certainly did. And for those of you that are just joining, where were you all day? A little disappointed, but that's all right. We'll forgive you.
And we're glad you're here now.
Yeah, we are glad you're here. And we are going to pick up where we left off. And in the last module, Susan took a look at creating the backend database. Now what we want to do is take a look at how we're going to update our code to connect to the database. Now, I'm actually going to do something a little different here. This is typically not something that we do on MVA. I'm going to put a cookie on the line for Susan. So Susan, if all of your demos work without a problem, you get 1 cookie.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
There we go.
Do I also get 1,000 points?
All right, and 1,000 points.
And
as well.
1,000. Okay. All right. So the pressure is
and 1,000
on.
points.
Cookie and 1,000 points.
Yes.
That's motivation.
All right.
And it's a chocolate cookie, and I have to admit, I have a bit of a weakness. All right. In that case, based on that, I better get into my code so I give myself time to do the demos really clean, really crisp, so that I know they all work.
Let's do it.
Okay, so what we're going to do in this, the last module, I showed you a little bit about what a relational database was, and I actually created a relational database in SQL Server and in SQL Azure, and a table in those 2 databases. But at the time, really, we were only looking at the databases. Now, of course, the key is to see if we can connect to those databases from our Python code and start inserting records and reading records. So that's what we're going to focus on in this module. So we're going to look at how do I actually connect to a database from Python code. And that really, I'll be honest with you, that's the key, getting the code to connect. Once you've got the code connecting to your database, then writing the code to insert a record, to retrieve a record is actually a little bit easier. So it's funny, even though it's only 2 lines of code to connect to a database, getting the connection string correct is a big part of the battle. So I'm going to try and help you guys out with that, so that when you have your first attempt connecting to a relational database from Python, hopefully it'll go really smoothly. So I beat my head against the wall for a while, so hopefully you won't have to when you're coding.
Again, going back to that whole, learn from other people's mistakes.
Yes.
Learn from Susan's mistakes.
Yes, and I made lots of mistakes connecting to my database from Python, so let me help you out here so you can benefit from all the things that went wrong for me. Just the joys of coding and learning new things. So how do you connect to a database from Python? Well, anytime you're writing any code that connects to a database, there's going to be a certain pattern to the code. When you're writing code in Python, if we think back, when we were first looking at Python, Python's a very bare bones language, very simple language. And when you want to add additional functionality, often there's libraries you have to add. So if you're going to connect to a relational database, you're going to need to install a Python library that's designed to help you to connect to that database. And there'll be different libraries you want to install depending on which database products you're working with. There are some libraries that work really well with SQL Server. There might be another library that works particularly well with MySQL. So just depending on the one you're looking for, do a little bit of research on which one works best for the database product you're connecting to. I'm going to make a couple of suggestions, but there are other libraries out there that are going to work. So find the one that's going to work for you. You can experiment. And if you're trying one and having trouble getting it working, maybe try a different one, and maybe that one will work better. I actually went through that experience myself, even just preparing these slides. There was one library I started with, and then I said, you know what, this one's a bit clunky, and I actually switched and used a different library, and things went a little bit more smoothly for me.
Absolutely, and that's one of the big things to keep in mind about open source is that it's community driven, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
But the catch is that unfortunately, some projects don't implement all the different features that people might want. Sometimes they slowly die on the vine. Sometimes they're really geared towards one environment, and so you really do have to, I think, be a bit flexible and just remember the core concepts. And you're going to notice that regardless of the database library that you decide to go with, is that there's still going to be kind of some basic concepts. That there's going to be a connection, there's going to be some way to execute a SQL statement, and there's going to be some way to read that data or potentially save that data back. So you are going to have all of that regardless of the type of library that you're using or the particular library that you're using. You're going to have those same types of method calls. So just sort of be flexible, I think, is the best way to approach all of this.
Yeah, and be flexible and a little bit patient. I said, this is community driven. These are amazing people who have taken their time to create these libraries. But it might be something they spent a lot of time working on when Python 3.3 came out. But when Python 3.4 came out, they didn't have time to go back and update their library for 3.4. Mm-hmm. So it may not run on Python 3.4 yet. Just because, hey, people are doing this on their own time, it's not always easy to find time to go back and update the libraries they've created. So just be prepared for spending a bit of time trying to find the right library to connect to your database. And I'm going to make some suggestions of libraries you may want to try.
Absolutely. I've got Gotham to watch, I've got other things to do.
You got other things to do.
Yeah,
there you go.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So obviously, when we're in Python and we want to use code that's in a library, one of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to add that Python library to our Python environment, and then we're going to need to import that library into our code, just like we imported Redis. We're going to import the libraries we use. And then once we've done that, now we'll be able to write that code that actually connects to our database. And that's going to be one of those magic moments, and I do my little victory dance when I get that working. And then then once you've got a connection to the database, at that point you'll be able to go ahead and execute commands, and these are going to be SQL commands because we're talking to a relational database. So SQL is the language we use to send commands to a database. And then if you are making changes to your actual database, one of the things you're also going to want to do is you're going to want to save your changes. So we do that with something called the commit command when we're talking to relational databases. So anytime we're inserting, updating, or deleting data, we're going to have to make sure that we commit our changes so they're actually saved to the database. Some libraries will actually commit automatically when you're done. Some libraries require you to explicitly say now commit, so that's something you might want to check on depending on the library you're using. The ones I'm using here in this demo require you to explicitly say now save, which is commit in SQL world. And then once you're done, you should always close your connection. This is something you want to get in the habit of. Open the connection, do what you need to do, close the connection. Open the connection, do what you need to do, close the connection. So that's another piece of the puzzle in terms of the pattern of talking to a relational database. So first of all, we're going to need to install a library that supports our database. The one I'm going to suggest, and I'm going to use in these demos, is PyPy ODBC. And it was funny, I actually went through like 4 different Python libraries trying to figure out which one was going to be the right one for the demo. I started off with PyMSQL, which is a great library for connecting to MySQL databases. And it worked great. I was able to connect it to SQL Server, but I had some trouble getting it to connect to SQL Azure. It said it was supported, but I was having some trouble with the connectivity. So I switched to another library called PyODBC. ODBC is type of database connection, the standard method of connecting to databases. So I tried PyODBC and managed to get that to connect to the different databases, and that worked fine, but it only works in Python 3.3. And the demo that Christopher and I have been working on is written in Python 3.4. So enter PyPy ODBC, which works great for SQL Server and for SQL Azure, and also works in Python 3.4 environments. But that took me a little while to get there. So I recommend it if you're working with Python 3.4, works really well. But just to give you that experience, like I said, that was the 4th library that I tried that would actually support, because I wanted to demonstrate lots of different database products to you. So this one works quite well across different products. So that's based on ODBC, which is a standard connection type supported by most databases, including SQL Server and SQL Azure. So all I need to do then, if I'm going to use that library, I'll have to go to my Python environment, and I'm going to have to add that package. Another little thing I ran into, if you start poking around with Python libraries, notice how it says we will download and install this using pip. I actually ran into trouble with one of the Python libraries I was exploring with where it wouldn't install with pip. And I had to change that option to easy install. So if you are getting error messages when you're trying to install the package, you can try changing that pip to easy install and it may work. I ran into that with one of the libraries I was trying out. Just a little heads up there in the world of learn from Susan's mistakes. And once you've got that package added to your environment, then you just use that import statement to add that library to your code. Once you've imported that library to your code, then you can create your connection to a database. Now, anytime you're connecting to a database, there's just certain information you're going to need. You're going to need to know the server name. So physically, what server is this database running on? Otherwise, your code won't be able to connect to it.
You're going to need to know where to connect to. Weird.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll go with you.
It's like picking up a phone and saying, "Hi, phone. I'd like to talk to Mike." Well, where is he? Oh, you mean I have to know his phone number? It's getting demanding there. So when you're connecting to a database, you're always going to have to give it a server name. If you are connecting to your own PC, you've installed the database locally, that's called localhost. That's how you refer to the PC you're running on. You're also going to need to specify the database name. We created one in the last module called QuizDB. So that was what we chose to name our database. So we'll have to remember that database name. We're going to need to log in. So we're going to need a user ID and a password as well. That's also going to be important. And once you install SQL Server, now I'm going to do this demonstration with SQL Server, but when you create a database in SQL Server, there's actually 2 ways for SQL Server to say, I trust you and I'll let you log in. So one of the ways of doing it is because SQL Server runs on Windows. Generally, you log into Windows with a user ID and password. So one of the things you can do that actually makes life easier for database administrators is to use something we call Windows Authentication. What Windows Authentication does is it says, hey, you already logged into Windows? I'll just use your Windows user ID to log you into the database as well. Because if you're at a big company, that means the person who manages the database doesn't have to create separate user IDs and passwords for everybody using their database. But For a lot of applications you might be building, here what we're doing with Python, you may need mixed mode authentication, which means you actually want people to be able to have a specific username and password for the database. Because somebody logging into your website from their MacBook, you don't have a Windows user ID password from that person. So maybe you're going to use a specific user ID and password to log into your database. So when you're using SQL Server, you're going to need to set it to mixed mode authentication. This is actually an option when you install SQL Server. You can actually choose mixed mode instead of Windows authentication. If you're working with a SQL Server database that's already installed, there's some actual instructions. If you take a glance here on the slide, I've got a link. And there's a link here which will take you to a page that shows you how you change from Windows authentication to mixed mode authentication. So all you're really doing here is saying, hey, SQL Server, I want to be able to have specify a user ID and password and create my own users inside the database. Don't use the Windows user ID to log them in, because we're going to pass in a user ID and password in our connection string. So that's just a little tip there. If you're working with SQL Server, it might throw you off if you haven't done it before. Once you have that information, you can now call a connect method to connect to the database. I love it when they use nice intuitive names for methods. So we use connect to our database.
I'm sorry you lost me.
I know. And you can see we're specifying the server name. So you can see there's our server name, and we're going to pass in a database name, and we're going to specify a user ID and a password. The only one I hadn't talked about was the driver name. Because this library supports connecting to different types of databases, the driver name is basically the hint of what kind of database am I talking to. So that's going to be different. If you're talking to Oracle, it'll be one driver. SQL, it'll be a different driver. If you're talking to MySQL, you might get a different driver. So that's going to change depending on the product you're connecting to. So for SQL Server, here's a nice simple example of a connection string we might use for SQL Server. You'll notice that we specify that our driver name is SQL Server because we're going to connect to a SQL Server database.
Seems simple enough.
I'm going to connect to my SQL Server database that I created on my machine, so I've specified a server name of localhost. We had a database name of QuizDB, and there's that user ID and password that I set up. Very secure password there.
Yes.
Capital P at SSW0RD, you know, so there you go. Nice secure password that I've created for my account. All right, now, one thing I do want to warn you about. When you start writing code, if you took the very first Python course with us about getting started with code, and we showed you how to do error handling in your code. If you want to find code that is going to blow up on you unexpectedly, this is it. Database connections. You go to connect to a database and everything's working fine, and you get all your code working, and then someday somebody moves the database to a new server, or renames the server, or changes the permissions, and you no longer have permission to access that server, or resets a password. So even though you don't change your code, and your code is running, and you've successfully connected, 2 weeks later, it's suddenly not working. Is just one of those things that happens. So code that has to leave your machine and go off and talk to another product on another machine, just because there's a lot of pieces of the puzzle to make the two things talk to each other, are very prone to blowing up. So as a result, this is a really, really good place to put some error handling. You're going to want to put code that's doing connections inside try except statements. I really, really recommend that. So when I do in my code, if you look here, what I'm going to typically do is basically I'm going to add a try and an except around my command that's actually trying to connect to the database. So really recommend that. The other thing you might want to do is even add print statements when you're first doing this. While you're trying to get it work that first time, what I actually like to do, and this is an old debugging trick that many coders used to use long before we had all these amazing interactive debuggers inside our tools.
When I was your age.
When I was young, and I was using my punch cards to code.
You used punch cards? We didn't even have punch cards. We were chiseling things into stone.
Absolutely. When I was first programming, bugs in code were truly bugs in code. That little known fact. I don't know if you know that's where the term bugs come from. It was actually bugs in computers.
Yep.
So just to come back to my code for a second. So what I will literally do is I'll put in a statement that says, hey, I'm trying to connect. And then I'll display a message to myself saying, hey, I've connected successfully. But if there's an error that's raised, then I'll say could not connect. And that's just something for me when I'm testing my connection to make sure it's working. Makes me more confident that things are working the way they're supposed to. Because otherwise you just run your code and you see nothing. You're like, well, did it work? So I find that very helpful. And in particular, if you're using Visual Studio to write your Python code, I'm going to show you something called an interactive window that you can use. And I really like that because it's an easy way to get more detailed error messages. So if your connection isn't working, you try to open a connection and it fails, and you're wondering, is it because the server name was wrong? Is it because of that IP address thing talking to Azure? Why is it blowing up? And you want a more detailed error message. The interactive window is a great tool because it'll spew out the giant error message, and then you can try and get an idea of what's wrong. So I'll try and show that to you as well when we do our demo. All right, so on that note, I should probably write some code. Oh, pressure now because the cookie's on the line. Oh, geez, I don't know if I can handle this. So let's go now and go back to some Python code and connect to our database. So I'm going to create a brand new project. As opposed to going inside, we're going to add the code afterwards. I'm going to show you how it looks inside our application. But just for now, let's start with a blank Python application called I want a cookie. Okay, so we're going to create that. And so I'm just creating an empty Python application here called I want a cookie.
Cookie.
And then I'm going to add a Python environment here for Python 3.4, because that's what I want to be working with.
Yep. Yeah, somebody actually just asked about how to install PyPy ODBC, and Susan is now going to walk through that. Somebody also mentioned that we should really just be able to say, Cortana, connect to database.
Oh, I like that. Yes. That's an excellent plan. Maybe that'll be the next edition of Visual Studio.
Exactly, yes.
Let's put in a feature request for that one.
Yeah, Visual Studio should support Cortana.
So now
Cortana, fix my code.
So now I go to my Python environment, and I say I need to install a Python package. And I'm going to specify that I need to install PyPy ODBC.
And you're just typing in the name of the library if you want to zoom in on that.
Yes, absolutely there. Yeah.
People sitting at home.
Whoops. Yeah, so I'm going to, so I'm basically typing in the name of the package here that I want to install, which is PyPy ODBC, and Visual Studio is going to then go ahead and find that package and install it into my environment for me. And you can see in the output window it's happening. And sure enough, right there now, you can actually see that that's there, that package added. Now, I'm also going to try and be a good programmer. You were showing us earlier about that requirements.txt file. Just so if anybody was adding, working my code later, I'm going to say, please generate a requirements.txt file.
Yep.
So that if anybody copied my code, they could quickly reinstall any libraries that I'm referencing in my code.
Yeah, and actually, if you open up that requirements text file, you'll notice that there's the PyPy ODBC. Now, it did put in the version number. The version number is optional. That if you just wanted to say, hey, just go grab whatever the most recent version is, then you could just simply list PyPy ODBC.
You should do that.
That does get a little risky, though, because as everybody can tell you, when software gets updated, something that worked a minute ago might not work in the newer version.
Yeah.
So, but if you're not specific to the version, then you can just simply say the name of the library, and it will go grab the most up-to-date one.
Yeah, so that's not something I have to do for my code to work, but it's just something that's a good habit to get into whenever you're adding packages to your Python environment.
Yep.
So now I'm going to go to my code, and instead of printing hello world, I'm going to import that new library, PyPy ODBC, and you can see because I've added the package to the environment, it actually comes up in IntelliSense. And then I'm literally going to go right away and start trying to create a connection.
Not my connection.
Yeah, I know. You could. It'll work as a something.
It does work. It's one of those things. It's sort of like, and that said, I of course did a demo earlier where we had R, but like my in front of variable names and single letter variables are just two of the things that just drive me crazy. But again, that's a 100% a personal preference thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Susan likes that.
I like to torment Christopher from time to time.
Well, that's really why you're doing this.
A totally different way of writing my code just to do it. I'm going to start calling on my variables int something shortly.
Yeah,
just to annoy you as well.
Thank you.
So now I had to specify, if you think back, we have to specify that driver value. So the driver, I'm going to connect to SQL Server. So I just specify that as a driver name. And you have to put a semicolon between them. And then the next parameter I have to specify is the server name. And my server is this. I've actually installed SQL Server on this machine. So that's going to be localhost. And then I'm specifying the database name, and I called it QuizDB.
And while Susan's typing here, somebody asked in the background, could they? And they specifically mentioned Oracle, so I'll answer it with Oracle. You know, could we use Visual Studio and Python and connect out to Oracle?
Sure.
And the answer is 100% yes. That you're free to do that.
In fact, I would probably start with the PyPy ODBC library for connecting to Oracle. It's likely just going to be a different driver that you specify.
Yep.
All right, so I specify the connection. I specified a driver name. I specified the server, the database, a user ID, and a password to log in with. And that's the same values I typed in when I was connecting for SQL Server Management Studio. And then I'm just going to put that inside a little try except statement. And that means I need to indent this and add a nice little except there. And basically, if it works, I'm going to say print woohoo, give me the cookie. And otherwise, I'm going to say bummer, no cookie. Okay. All right.
Although, to be fair, this is only your first demo. You still have more demos to go. All of them have to work here. Okay. Yeah, this is an all or nothing proposition.
Okay.
You've got a double quote and a single quote. On
yes.
You know, I should have told you that. I should have let you.
Yeah. Well, I saw for squigglies. I was looking. All right. So I've got it going. So I've got my connection, and it's going to run and connect. And the other thing I do want to do is after the connection has opened, if it did open successfully, I then want to close it. So that is just a good habit. You want to be opening and closing your connections as you go through. So, moment of truth, I try to run my code. This is just a command line application, so it's literally going to open a command window here, and it says, woohoo, give me the cookie. All right, Chris.
Not yet. You still got more demos. But while you're at it, go ahead and recolor that. And while Susan's recoloring this in the background, I do want to mention that the reason that she's going with a command line here is because we are getting into a bit of new code that can be a little bit complex. And it's always nice just to start out with just focused on the code, and then we'll go ahead and incorporate this back in. So we will bring this back into our web app. Just right now, we're just trying to show this is the basics of working with SQL Server.
Yeah. Now, I do want to do one thing. I'm just going to break it on purpose. So just, this is not a failed. If it actually fails in this case, it is a success. So what I'm going to do
So if it works, it's a failure.
Yes, if it works, it's a failure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here to my environment, and I'm actually going to go to that environment, and I'm going to right-click on that and bring up, say, open an interactive environment, because I want to show you how, if it does fail, how you can get a better error message to help you figure out what's wrong in your connection string, because that is where you're going to have the biggest battles, is getting that connection string. So I'm going to open an interactive window, and I'll bring this up here so you can see it a little bit better. There we go. And all I literally do...
Sound effects help?
Yep, absolutely. Got to have sound effects. And then you literally take your code. So you pretend you're writing the program live. First, I import PyPy ODBC. Then I try to do this connection string. All right, so I have this connection string. Whoop, I blew that one up even faster. Oh, and it's complaining because it's not in a try statement, not indented. So that wasn't the error I was going for. So let's try that again. Let me just clear the screen and type in that connection. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to deliberately make a mistake in the password. So what you're going to see is when I try to connect, of course, that's going to fail. Now, if I had done this in my connection string, I would just see my little accept message coming back saying, bummer, no cookie. But now when I run, what's really nice is if you zoom in a bit, you can actually see that I get the login failed for user SA. So that gives me a hint that my server name was right, the driver was okay, but it couldn't do the login. If you mistype the server name, it's going to give you some sort of message about the server not being there. If you're connecting to Azure and you haven't released the IP address, it's going to come back and say, hey, that IP address isn't recognized by Azure and we won't let you in. So using this interactive environment is really helpful for getting a more detailed error message if the connection fails, so you can hopefully better debug your code. I use this a lot when I was trying to get all these demos working and exploring some of the different libraries. So just wanted to share that little tool with you. All I did was I just right-clicked on the environment, chose Open Interactive Window, and just typed the commands here. You can clear the commands out here and reset it. And you just type your code here, and then you'll see the error message directly on your screen. So that can be a useful tool for debugging. All right.
That's all in this episode. I hope this tutorial was helpful. In the next episode, we will continue with the remaining part of this course, which is creating websites with Python, Flask, and SQL. Is your mind ringing with questions, queries, or doubts? Do you wish to learn more? Then visit our website www.millionlights.org and post your questions on our forum. We will be really happy to clear all your doubts. If you missed anything and want to rewatch it, you can download it from our website or can watch online as well. You can also participate in our webinars, discussions with the subject experts, as well as get Microsoft certification on various courses through our website. You can also find us on Facebook by the name Millionlights and also on Twitter. For more such interesting tutorials on coding, app development, programming, and building rich UIs, keep watching Microsoft Art of Code, brought to you by Millionlights. Thank you.